This came from a book, Brian Selznick, whose name you saw up there. How did you find out about his work and his screenplay that made you say, aha, this is a property for me?
I read the script before the book, and it was actually due to the fact that Sandy Powell, my costume designer, who I've worked with many years on several films, worked with Brian, worked on the film Hugo, the Scorsese film, which was based on Brian's novel, The Invention of Hugo Cabret. And they got to be very close friends. And she was visiting Brian, and she read his book, Wonderstruck. And she said, I could see this being something Todd could do. And
an illustrator as well. So.
His books use drawings and text. And in the case of Wonderstruck, the entire 1927 story that was depicted like a silent film in our movie is told in drawings. And the 70s story is told in text, and they interweave throughout the course of the books. It's a very lovely concept for a young adult novel using image and text. So Brian, I don't think I was the first person that came to Brian's mind. This was the first adaptation from one of his books that he himself wrote, because he just didn't think of me as somebody who made films for a younger audience. So I read the script first, and it really was beautifully, it was starting to really think of how this should be a movie and how it could use film language and how it could really embrace cinema, because it's so not based on dialogue, because the two kids are deaf, or one of them becomes deaf during the course of the film. So it really needed the visual language of film to make it work.
How did you get New York to bend to your will, to be two New Yorks, none of them the New York of today?
I'd say a lot of that was due to our extraordinary production designer, Mark Friedberg, who really had a kind of vision of like, all right, we can, that corner in Bushwick, but when we turn around, we're in Crown Heights, and then up the street, we're back in Manhattan. I mean, he really had a vision that was very specific to locations that existed. I mean, when I think of time, to me, one of the most extraordinary moments in the movie is when Ben opens the door from Port Authority and he's in Times Square. And I love that moment because it feels, I grew up in New York City, and it feels to me incredibly authentic in a way that I don't think I've seen a movie do in a long time. And that was really Mark figuring out this corner, this piece, that piece, in a great way.
For you, Christine, for having New York almost as a character in the film, but a character that plays two roles too. The challenges of, as we were just hearing about, getting to use the museum, for example. How did you overcome some of these?
Well, the museum was the museum was wonderful to us, and I think they really understood, not to talk about that other Natural History Museum movie, but they sort of understood how this movie was almost true to their bones and true to their ideals in a way that they really wanted to support. So they're a museum. They are a mecca. I mean, the fact that we got those 6 nights in there was pretty amazing. Night at the Museum didn't get 6 nights in there, and they could pay a lot more than we could. But so they were incredibly supportive, and that and also not just in terms of like the space, but allowing the spaces that you see where the kids are, where Ben and Jamie are running around behind the scenes. That was really the museum. Those long hallways, corridors with filing cabinets, etc. That was also still in the museum.
Highly protected areas with temperature control and precious collections within all of those cabinetries. So we had guards, and there was a lot of red tape to get through, but we managed to do it. And they were incredibly helpful, but there was a bureaucracy certainly to navigate.
How did you make silence a positive instead of just an absence of sound?
Well, we just decided to make the soundtrack, from the music to the sound design, a character in the film from the very beginning. Began really talking deeply with Carter Burwell, the composer, about the role music would play. Of course, music played such a central role at the height of the silent era in movies, but I also suspected that it was going to play an important role in the Ben story as well, and that the Ben story music could play a more subjective role because he had only just become deaf. So for him stepping out into the city, that we wanted to play with perspective sound. There'd be moments where all of a sudden we're kind of hearing the world through his ears. The one thing we learned is that there is no such thing as absolute silence for deaf people. Every deaf person perceives some register of sound, some dimension of sound, some frequency. And Ben also only just became deaf. So there was even the idea that there would be memory of sound, or a kind of phantom limb of sound that would be invading his experience, you know? So I thought, what a great, rich opportunity to try to evoke that and make the viewers, hearing audiences, really think about what hearing means, you know, and what it might be like to be without it.
Christine, have you gotten any feedback from the deaf community? Do you know, were they consulted in the course of this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we started working with the deaf community, like, from day one. I mean, obviously, first and foremost, in finding Millicent Simmons, you know, our casting director, Laura Rosenthal, really, you know, she had to figure out all the different ways to figure out, to find children, to find little girls that could potentially play the role. And of course that started out with, you know, theater groups, but you know, Millicent actually, I think you said earlier she'd done some acting but not in films. She'd really done just a little acting in school. She really, I mean, I'd say it's
school Shakespeare, I think.
Right. You know, who hasn't? You know, I mean, so
Begone thou varlet.
So that process was just to talk about that a little bit because I think it's interesting. I think Laura thinks she saw over 200 or 300 girls.
Wow.
They self-taped. They didn't all walk through her office. And then she and her team narrowed it down to about a dozen, and Todd narrowed that down to about 5 or 6, and then to 2. Right. And we brought those 2 to New York. It was Millicent and another girl. But it was a really careful process. And anyway, we started involving the deaf community at that point. And also just, you know, we wanted to make sure, at the risk of, you know, the pun, we wanted to make sure they felt heard and that they felt like this movie, the same way Brian Selznick's book was very respectful to their community and sort of inhaled their experiences in ways that were very meaningful. Millicent had read the book, and in her sort of audition introduction tape, she said, "I identify with Rose. I really feel like I know what she went through."
How lovely.
Which was incredible. I think we were both like, you know, everybody was. So the fact that Brian had already laid down that groundwork, we just picked it up.
It also describes, the film itself in the 2 halves, describe the history of deaf experience in America, in that the 1920s, there was a real stigma attached to being deaf. Deaf education.
You were locked away.
You were locked away. People didn't know what to do with you. Exactly. And oralism was taught. If you were lucky enough to get an education at all, you were basically taught how to speak and how to assimilate into the speaking world. The language was not taken seriously. It wasn't until the early 1960s that articles came out that started to talk about ASL, American Sign Language, and sign language in general, as a real language with all the complexities and grammatical, you know, integrity of any spoken language. And it ushered in a whole new era of awareness about deaf experience and signing. I think most of us will remember that the 70s was a time where it was like, oh yeah, people are signing. You know, I think I got really into it when I was a young person.
It was a period, everybody's rights were being asserted.
Exactly.
For once.
Absolutely, and Americans with Disabilities Act shortly followed as legislation. But that is also shown in the movie where it's a little Latino boy who goes to the public school system in New York City who actually knows the alphabet before the little boy who just lost his hearing from Minnesota. So it shows how the culture had changed. Julianne Moore found a life for herself and a vocation for herself and a way to live as a deaf person by this time in our history.